everybody, what's going on? I'm Shane, and I love games. First off, before we get too far into this video, I wanted to say thank you for all of your support for the first video that went up the other day. I'm very excited to be back on YouTube, and I'm excited that you're excited that I'm back on YouTube. Lots of nice comments, lots of good feedback. Thank you very much. For this video, it's kind of a supplementary video to the other one that I did. In that, I'm going to give you a really basic idea of what a tabletop RPG or role-playing game is. Now, there are hundreds of videos on YouTube that describe what a TTRPG is, and those are fine. However, for the sake of this channel, I better put one up here just in case you're wondering what it is, how to get into it, and what they're all about. Now, for the sake of this video, I'm going to use Dungeons & Dragons as the example. One, it's kind of the godfather of all tabletop role-playing, so using it as the example just seems fitting. Also, I have a lot of the books. There are hundreds of thousands of tabletop role-playing games out there, so maybe D&D isn't your thing. However, just for the sake of this video, it will be the example that I use. It's the most easiest to describe and explain. There are thousands of them out there, so if fantasy combat isn't your thing, then there's something out there for you. So this video is going to be a very basic, very simple introduction as to how a tabletop role-playing game works, some of the core mechanics of Dungeons & Dragons itself, as every game is so different that it would be almost impossible to say, here's how the mechanics of all RPGs work, because that's just not the case. That sounds scary, doesn't it? Don't worry. Now, if it's your first time, you're going to have someone that's going to be able to help you. And if you don't, there's lots of people online that can help. You probably know somebody who does tabletop role-playing, and you just don't know it. If after watching this video you're interested in trying, reach out to your friends, your family. Somebody, especially these days, probably role-plays. So without any further ado, let's jump into the example. The first time you sit down to play, odds are you're not going to have anything. Luckily, your friends will have more than enough. Some basic things that you require for most games, especially Dungeons & Dragons, are dice. Now, there are several different types of dice depending on what you're doing. We'll get into that later. Don't worry too much about that. But what's going to happen is you're going to sit down with your friend, who's likely going to be the Dungeon Master, the Game Master, the Storyteller. Now, we'll get into that role in a little bit. Suffice to say, what they're going to do is they're going to help you create a character using a handbook of some type. Now, game books come in all different shapes and sizes, like we said, but again, for this example, we're going to use Dungeons & Dragons. With the help of your Dungeon Master, you'll create a character, almost like writing a story. And when you create that character will end up on a character sheet, like this. Now, this looks complicated. There's lots of numbers, there's a little bit of math involved, particularly in Dungeons & Dragons, but it's very self-explanatory once you get into the game. Basically what this means is these are numbers that are going to affect when you roll this, your dice. Sometimes you're good at stuff, sometimes you're bad at stuff. The better you are at stuff, the higher number gets added to this die. And that's basically how this game is played. It is pretend with rules. Imagine being back on the playground and having those fights with your friends going, I shot you, no I shot you, etc., etc., and arguing over who's dead. Well, Dungeons & Dragons and games like that essentially put rules to those kinds of pretend games. It's kind of funny, but even as an adult, we still like that creative aspect. And that's the great thing about Dungeons & Dragons and tabletop role-playing games is you can be something that you're not in real life and still have that pretend play aspect in your life as an outlet. Some other things that might get involved in your game, something like this is the map, which is a dry erase map to help visualize dungeons that you're traveling in. Also miniatures. These are not necessary, but they certainly help with the theater of the mind's eye. Some other things you'll need, some pencils for writing notes down. When you're playing, it's very similar to improv. There will be problem solving in some aspects. There will be conversations had between yourself and other players and other characters, and even with the Dungeon Master themselves, who were basically everyone else in the known universe. And that seems like a pretty big role to take. But don't worry about that, because right now you're just you. You are just a single character, kind of making your way in the world that the Dungeon Master will describe for you. And you can interact with that world in any way that you want. That's the other thing. You can try and do anything that you want in this world. The freedom given to players is almost astronomical within the confines of the game. You can certainly try to do anything, and sometimes that can create havoc within the game. One player may want to go left, another player may want to go right. Sometimes it comes down to simple dice rolls, or you may split the party, which is a terrible idea, and don't ever do that. Within each game, you'll encounter monsters, other characters. Eventually, you'll have to solve the problem. Now, simply enough, there might be a princess to save, a dagger to find, treasure to be had. As you keep doing this, your character gains what's known as experience, basically points, like in a video game. As you gain experience, you gain levels, your character becomes more powerful, they're able to do more things, and they can advance in the story, which ultimately becomes tougher and tougher as you level up. Very much similar to, if you think, World of Warcraft and its different areas. The same thing can happen in a Dungeons & Dragons or tabletop role-playing game world. If you're just this one character, how is the world created and who does this? Well, for that, we're going to take a moment and talk about likely the most important role of any tabletop role-playing game is the Dungeon Master. Games Master, Storyteller, Referee, whatever the fancy name is per game that they're called, they all essentially have one role, and that is to direct the story. The Dungeon Master, or Storyteller, or Referee is generally also very familiar with the rules, so if it's your first time playing, you generally don't have to know too much about the game, as the DM should be the one explaining it to you. Or, if you're proactive, you've gone ahead and read the rules, and you know what you're doing. Now, what is it that the Dungeon Master is actually doing, and why am I hiding behind the screen? What will end up happening generally is that sometimes they'll have a pre-written, pre-generated story that they're guiding you through. They're describing things that you see and people that you interact with. Very similar to an improv class where you're asking the audience for examples or direction. Now, this is a very old pre-written scenario for the first edition of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. This is called Slave Pits of the Undercity. For every game, there are dozens upon dozens upon dozens of pre-written scenarios, generally tailored for levels, for difficulty, for different game styles. Some of them are far more combat, some of them are more social. Depending on your players and what kind of adventure you're looking for, you can generally find a pre-written scenario dedicated to that. The Dungeon Master will then begin to describe the adventure to you as such. So as you can see in here, there's a lot of reading the Dungeon Master has to do. Generally, they come very prepared and already know what's going to happen. They're hiding it behind the screen to hide it from you, the player, so that it's a surprise, so that you don't know what's coming up and you can't prepare. Very similar to real life. Imagine that. The description of Slave Pits of the Undercity: it is time to put a stop to the marauders. For years, the coastal towns have been burned and looted by the forces of evil. You and your fellow adventurers have been recruited to root out and destroy the source of these raids. But beware! Hundreds of good men and women have been taken by the slavers and have never been seen or heard from again. As you progress through the story, with the help of Matt and miniatures, the Dungeon Master will generally draw out what you see and what you've interacted with. This screen protects their dice rolls, so that you don't know really what you're facing. You shouldn't know kind of what your monsters, how tough they are, and what their advantages to their rolls are. On the other side of the screen, most times, art, but on the inside, helpful tips, tricks, charts for the Dungeon Master to help the game run more smoothly. The crazy thing is, this Dungeon Master, while a referee, doesn't really choose where the story is going, because that's going to be on you, the player. You are the ultimate factor into how this game is going to go. Now, a Dungeon Master, if they're not good, you'll definitely kick open the door, kill the monster, find the loot. But if you have a good Dungeon Master who takes into account maybe your character's story, puts on voices, maybe even dresses up, all of these are perfectly acceptable ways to play Dungeons & Dragons. There's no wrong way to play. And that's the thing. This game can be changed depending on how you want to play and what your players and yourself are looking for in a game. Do you just want to kick open the door and loot the room and find the treasure and level up and that's it? You never really talk to each other? That's perfectly acceptable. There's nothing wrong with that. This game is designed, and most are, for combat and reward. However, to get the full experience of a tabletop role-playing game, you have to put a little bit of yourself into it. The best people that I've found to play are those who are open to almost embarrassing themselves with their acting. Now remember, you're playing someone that is very different from yourself. So imagine that I'm actually going to play a half-orc barbarian named Dirt. Maybe he talks like this. Now I don't have to talk like that the whole game, but when I'm in character, very much like a movie, I might talk like this to help the atmosphere. That is acceptable. You don't have to do that, but it's one of the factors that makes tabletop role-playing games so much fun. You're going to get out what you put in, and don't be afraid to act a little silly, or ask questions. At the end of the day, the Dungeon Master is a referee and shouldn't really be what they call a rules lawyer. Rolling behind this screen will also help them fudge dice. Now, there's quite a bit of debate over whether or not Dungeon Masters should fudge dice, but if all of a sudden all of your players in their first encounter are going to die, you may want to peel back a little bit on the harshness. That way they don't get discouraged right off the bat and never want to play with you again. The great thing about this game is, again, there's no wrong way to play, and you can modify rules as you see fit. You can throw the rulebook out the window and make your own game. A little difficult, especially keeping things balanced, but the options are there. In this day and age, tabletop role-playing game is at the height of its popularity, once again, as it was in the early 80s. Only this time, it's gotten much more positive exposure. Once upon a time, Dungeons & Dragons fell into the era of the Satanic Panic. A time when heavy metal music and Satanism were rampant, apparently, throughout the world, causing parents to go insane thinking that their children were worshipping Satan and sacrificing themselves in the name of a game. Well, simply put, that's not true, especially in this day and age, when this game is more accessible than ever before, and you are seeing such a wide variety of people from all walks of life getting together to create a story with their friends, having a good time, and at the end of the day, having a shared experience. That is what I love the most about tabletop role-playing. I love being a player, but I also love being a dungeon master, a game master, whatever you want to call it. I love sitting down with my friends and telling a story with them. Not at them or to them, but with them. Setting up a goal for the end of the day, here's what I'd like to see, is alright. But sometimes your players, or even you, are going to take that story and throw it right out the darn window. And sometimes, those stories are the best. I hope my explanation has been simple enough for everyone to grasp it, but also intriguing enough that you might want to try it. As I said before, there are many ways to get into it. Online, look for your local gaming store and just tell them, hey, I'm new and I'd like to learn a little bit more. There are plenty of examples on YouTube now, especially with Critical Role and Penny Arcade's Acquisitions Incorporated being so popular to watch online. Thousands of YouTubers and Twitch streamers are playing online for other people to enjoy and watch. And that might be the best way to get a feel for if you're interested in playing tabletop role-playing games or not. If you're also interested, there's a podcast that I would highly recommend called Vintage RPG Podcast, where they discuss some of the older and newer games. I'm friends with those guys, so I'm giving them a free shout out because I really like them. That being said, I hope you found this video interesting, and I hope that if you're not currently a player, you give it a try, because it's awfully fun. And if you are a player, I bet you can't wait to play again. Right? Thanks for watching, and remember, there's always a bigger fish. I wasn't recording any of that through audio. You know what? I'm not going to go back and do it again.